Will Corsica turn into France's Catalonia? President Emmanuel Macron has begun a two-day visit to the Mediterranean island, where there's growing demand for greater autonomy from France. As separatist movements rise across Europe, how will it affect this region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. Scotland and Catalonia are well-known hotspots in Europe for their struggle for independence. But there are many other secessionist movements across the continent, some seeking to break away, others simply wanting more say. In France, the island of Corsica has long sought to have greater autonomy from the central government in Paris. And with nationalists winning big in regional elections, there's been more pressure on the government to negotiate. French President Emmanuel Macron arrived in Corsica on Tuesday with the backdrop of a rising nationalist sentiment on the island. Some Corsicans want special status and greater autonomy. This is not a new demand and has plagued French governments for decades, and President Macron is expected to set the tone for relations with Paris moving forward. Thousands of nationalist supporters marched through the streets ahead of his visit, calling for democracy. This is what some of them had to say.
We want Corsica to be able to manage itself like New Caledonia or Guadeloupe. We are on the other side of the Mediterranean. Obviously, we are different. We are waiting for this recognition.
We are here for our young people, so that Corsica will be better on all levels, so they can find work, stay at home and develop Corsica.
Well, let's take a closer look now at the nationalist movement in Corsica, which has been seeking greater autonomy since the 1960s. The Mediterranean island has been part of France since 1768, but it's geographically closer to the Italian coast and has a population of 330,000. Despite being a popular tourist destination, Corsica is one of the least developed regions of France. Some are now asking for changes to the constitution that would give the island special status and a recognition of the Corsican language. The island's main separatist group, the National Liberation Front of Corsica, announced a ceasefire in 2014 after a series of bomb attacks in the mid-1970s. Well, let's bring in our guest now. In the French city of Saint-Malo, Jacques Rolland, who's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. And in Edinburgh, Scotland, Michael Keating, professor at the University of Aberdeen and director of the Centre for Constitutional Change. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being on Inside Story. Jacques Rolland, if I can start with you. The Corsica issue had been quiet for some time now on the French political scene. Why are we seeing this renewed push for autonomy now and this renewed push for special status now?
I would not say it's been quiet for quite a while. Yes, it has pacified in the last 3 years since 2014, when the Corsican liberation movement, which really started in the mid-70s, so 40 years before, decided to give up the armed struggle and to come out of clandestinity and to start playing the normal political game. As a result of that, they were elected in 2015 to the regional council, and they won again the autonomist and independent movement, who joined forces, won 56% of the vote in the December election for the regional assembly. So now they have a large majority in the National Assembly, and they are ready to discuss politically with the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron, who had said during his campaign that he was ready to make some amendments to the constitution, which would give Corsica more autonomy.
Jacques, as you say, the nationalists achieved their best ever performance in December's regional elections. To what do you attribute this success? What has fueled this renewed sense of nationalism among Corsicans?
Oh, it's been there for quite a while. The Corsicans have a strong identity. They've only been part of France for 250 years. They were annexed by France in 1758. And they've always had a very strong local identity. They have their own language, their own cultures. The Corsicans are a very homogeneous people. And they feel a bit they've been feeling very frustrated, especially the one aspect is the fact that this island is a very beautiful island, which attracts lots of tourists and wealthy French people who build in areas where they can no longer afford to buy property themselves. And that's one of the elements which is one of the demands actually of the nationalists is to create a special resident status which would give them priority on the housing market, which is obviously a very difficult thing to achieve. But it's a sense that you also find a bit everywhere. It's not just Corsica. You can see it in the rest of Europe, in Scotland, in Catalonia, and all that. With the advent of Europe, people, many countries, many regions feel that they should have their own identity, have more power at the local level.
Right.
And we have also in France a few other regions with a strong identity. Let's not forget that France is constituted of many different areas, the Basque region, the Breton region, the Flanders region, the Savoy region, all of them with a strong identity, which is contrary to the French tradition of uniformity within the country. But Corsica obviously has a head start because it is an island.
Right. As you say, Jacques, there's been a lot of talk on the rise of separatist movements across Europe in recent years. There was the Scottish referendum on independence in 2014, of course, which saw Scotland narrowly vote against leaving the United Kingdom. In Italy, 2 northern regions voted last year to negotiate greater autonomy from Rome. And then there's, of course, Spain. Catalonia's controversial secession referendum in October last year sparked a political crisis, including the arrests and charges against Catalan leaders. Michael Keating in Edinburgh, there's concern, especially within the European Union, about a contagion effect, that more regions in Europe could seek to establish their own states. Do you think that what happened in Spain, in Catalonia, could happen in France, in Corsica, for instance?
Well, I'll leave Corsica to my colleague who's just been explaining it. But in fact, there are very few separatist movements in Europe. There's Scotland, there's Catalonia that have had referendums that have separatist parties in government, and that is about it. What we're seeing elsewhere is the rise of regionalism and autonomy, which is not quite the same thing. And the 2 Italian cases you mentioned are regions looking for autonomy within Italy. There was a separatist movement of the Lega Nord around the notion of Padania. That has been pretty much abandoned. Even in Spain, the Basques are moving away from separatism towards negotiating more autonomy, which is where we are in Scotland. Now, this has got a lot to do with European integration. It's got a lot to do with globalization. And the feeling in these territories that they don't really need the central state anymore. They've got to make their own way in the world. And sometimes this occurs in wealthy regions, not always, but sometimes in wealthy regions who resent having to pay for their poorer compatriots when they have to make their own way in a competitive world. So there's an economic as well as a cultural dimension to this.
Michael, the independence movements in Spain and Scotland use membership of the European Union as something that would facilitate independence. Do you think that helped or hindered their goals, their aspirations?
Well, in the case of Catalonia, it made independence look rather more plausible because it would keep open access to the Spanish market as well as the European markets. Catalonia is a trading nation. There's very little Euroscepticism in Spain anyway, but the European Union made it clear that it would not recognize a unilateral declaration of independence by Catalonia. If Spain didn't recognize it, the EU wouldn't recognize it. In Scotland, it's quite different because the referendum was agreed with the United Kingdom government. So had Scotland voted to become independent, there would be no reason for any other member state to prevent it becoming a full member of the European Union. Indeed, no member state actually did say they would veto it, not even Spain. The further complication, of course, is that Scotland voted by a large majority to remain in the European Union at the time of the Brexit referendum. And so it's the Scots who want to stay in the European Union and the English who want to pull out. And that has put the whole question of independence back on the agenda and created the possibility of a European boundary running between England and Scotland.
What about the case of Northern Ireland, Michael?
That's even more complicated because Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union as well. Although there was a division, the nationalist community voted to remain by a large majority, the Protestant community, the Unionists, by a smaller majority to leave. If the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, this creates a European hard border between the two parts of Ireland, in complete contradiction to everything that's been achieved in the peace process in the last 20 years. And the Irish government have made it very clear that part of the deal that the UK has with the European Union will be resolving that border question. But the United Kingdom has not come up with any proposals as to how that is going to be done. They just keep on going round and round the problem.
Well, let's bring back Jacques Rolland into the conversation and talk a bit more about Corsica and France. Jacques, when it comes to size and clout, a lot of people would say that Corsica is nowhere near Catalonia because Corsica is still very reliant on mainland France. So explain to our viewers around the world what is behind this desire for greater autonomy, and in what ways do nationalists in Corsica feel they can benefit from being less tied to the central government in Paris?
Yes, in the case of Corsica, the revendication is not economic, it's cultural. Corsica depends on French for financing, on a French budget. It receives 2 billion euros more than it contributes. So it needs French money. And up to now, many people said that the independentist movement was more like a racket in order to try to extract more and more financing from the French state through threats and so on. And there was also a kind of mafia-like dimension within the Corsican independentist movement, with quite a few criminals. Now that the independentist movement is more political, more mature, then the talk about autonomy is there, but there's still not demand for independence because
So independence is not, are you saying that independence is not a long-term aspiration for the nationalists?
The long-term aspirations, if Corsica develops the means to be economically independent. At the moment, they're just talking about autonomy and asking for a special tax status. The fear in France is that this special tax status could lead to Corsica becoming a tax haven, and therefore as a way to guarantee its financial future. But for the moment, they're only talking about autonomy. And if there was a referendum, you could say that in Corsica, people would vote against independence because they know which side their bread is buttered on. While if there was a referendum involving the whole of France, I'm pretty sure that the majority of the French would vote for independence for Corsica, because many of them are actually a bit fed up, or were fed up, with the nature of the independentist movement in its early years and its mafia-like approach to negotiations.
Michael, looking at the wider Europe, what is fueling? You say that when we talk of independence movement, there are really two independence movement that we should focus on, and that is Scotland and Spain. But across the continent, regions in the past that have sought greater autonomy from their central government, we've seen a rise in a way of these nationalist movement. What's behind that?
Well, you've got to remember that the borders between European states are pretty artificial. They're fairly recent. We mustn't assume that there's something wrong with the system because people want to shift the boundaries. And part of it is about democratization, part of it is about culture, part of it is about economics. A lot of it is about the construction of Europe and the aspiration for a Europe that is not just built upon nation states. But it's not a universal trend. There's not a lot of this in Scandinavia. In Eastern Europe, the emphasis now is upon state nationalism. It's about Polish nationalism, Hungarian nationalism, rather than regionalism. So this phenomenon is confined to a few countries where there is a coincidence of economic grievances with cultural concerns, with political alienation. And these are in Spain, in Belgium, in the United Kingdom, and to some extent in France with the case of Corsica, which, as Jack has pointed out, has strong historical and cultural roots to it.
Right. Jacques, President Macron is currently under pressure because the nationalists have done quite well in recent elections. And some of Macron's allies have said he would make a gesture towards the nationalists. But what gestures can he realistically make without going against the French constitution? I mean, even granting special status to Corsican residents or an official role for the Corsican language would go against the French constitution, wouldn't it?
Indeed, because it says in France that the constitution says that the French Republic is indivisible. But you can have some special status for some regions, such as the overseas territories, like Guadeloupe, Martinique, Island of Reunion, and maybe it would be ready to grant a right to be different. But the Corsicans would like, in French constitution, the mention of the recognition of the Corsican people, which goes against the French concept, which is a bit, in my opinion, also a bit too strict, of uniformity, equality and uniformity. Everyone is equal, whether you're Breton, you can't have privileges. That go back to the revolution, the metric system and so on. Mm-hmm. This culture, this desire, the Jacobin side of the French Republic, which has made every effort to kill any cultural difference between the people. Like, for example, I'm from Brittany, and there was a deliberate campaign in the 1920s to eradicate the Breton language. They did it quite successfully. In Corsica, there was the same campaign, but Corsica, being an island, has been able to retain, and through the development of the independentist movement in the 70s, people have been learning Corsicans again, and everyone wants to speak, is more or less able to speak Corsican. But for example, the independentists or the autonomists are demanding the co-official status for Corsican language and French. And that is totally unacceptable to the French, because if you require every document to be written in Corsican as well in French, it would cost a fortune. And if you require all officials in Corsica to speak Corsican as well as French, it would be discrimination against the non-Corsican, because in France, everyone is French, and therefore the demand for co-officials language is very difficult to admit. Tax status, some ground can be found there. Some a consensus can be found on relative ease of taxation, but making sure that doesn't have not fiscal autonomy in order to tax. So the demands are fairly reasonable, but some of them will have to be negotiated.
You say the demands are reasonable, but what can they realistically expect from President Macron? I mean, can he succeed where his predecessors have failed? Can he rein in these nationalists in Corsica?
It will not be easy, but what they're expecting is that President Macron has always been insistent that he wanted a constitutional reform in France, for example, with less MPs, a different second house, and that constitutional reform, which has to be adopted by 3/5 of Parliament, both houses of Parliament, or by referendum, could include a change saying that there's a right for regions to be different, or to have a slightly different status, to give more autonomy. So within that, there could be a possibility within the framework of national institutional reform. But I don't think that it would be in a position to accept, to write, as the Corsican autonomists want, a mention in the constitution of the existence of a Corsican people that would go against the French principle of indivisibility.
Michael Keating in Edinburgh, we've talked about how some of the central government have been dealing with these nationalists and, you know, the issue of more autonomy. But what about the European Union, you know, Brussels? How have they handled this so far?
They've not handled it well at all. When the European Union expanded to Central and Eastern Europe, they had provisions about minority rights and about concern about the structure of government and so on. As soon as a country gets into the European Union, it's no longer subjected to that conditionality. So there was a very confused response to the situation in Scotland, where when Kosovo became independent, some European countries recognized it, others didn't. They have a different response every time a crisis comes up. And in the case of Catalonia, they just weren't present. They just mouthed the slogans about it being an internal Spanish matter when it's clearly something of greater international importance. So there's a little bit done through the Council of Europe, through the Venice Commission, but at the European level there's a very weak capacity to deal with these things, which are going to become a challenge to Europe in the future.
Mm-hmm. If they are going to be a challenge, taking the example of Catalonia, for instance, you have a political crisis there that shows no sign of ending anytime soon. Who should be stepping in to resolve this, you think?
Well, it would be useful to have some kind of international arbitration. I mentioned the Council of Europe and the Venice Commission. The European Commission really isn't equipped to deal with these kinds of things. The Council of Ministers, perhaps. But we've seen a number of cases, and there will be more in the Balkans, for example, where there is a need, where it is a European responsibility. And they don't even have any clear criteria as to when they would recognize breakaway states or not. There was no clear judgment about the case of Scotland, and that would have been a fairly easy one. In the case of Spain, of course, possibly there's nothing that Europe can do because both sides in Spain in the Catalonian argument have got themselves entrenched into absolute deadlock there with little room for compromise. But certainly one would expect Europe, because many nationalists have looked to Europe as a way of resolving these questions, of getting beyond the model of the nation state. But Europe's response has really been to go back to that old model of the nation state and say that it's nothing to do with us. That I think is not satisfactory any longer.
Okay, well, Jacques Rolland, let's end with what's happening in France and Corsica. The recently elected administration in Corsica has said, you know, if they don't get the special status that they're asking for from the central government in Paris, then they would go ahead and push for statehood. Could we see a similar crisis in France than the one that we've seen in Spain and Catalonia? And there's some who have even said that there could be a return of the violence that we saw in France back in the 70s and 80s. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I think the second option would be the more likely. I don't think you would have a movement such as in Catalonia, because as I said earlier, most Corsicans don't want to be independent. They depend too much on French financing at this stage, many actually French civil servants and so on, and it would make their situation a bit insecure and precarious. But you could have, once again, a return to violence. Violence is never far from the surface in Corsica, which is an island with very specific traditions of clandestinity. It's been going for always. They are very rebellious people, and they would, in order to gain what more from the government, resort to violent action again. Yes, that would be the most likely scenario.
All right, well, we hope it doesn't get to that. Thank you very much for speaking to us, both Jacques Rolland, Michael Keating. Thank you both for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Of course, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Foliba Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.